Hello everyone, we're at the Panzermuseum Munster and we are taking a look at the Sturmpanzer IV.
And this video was sponsored by the free-to-play game War Thunder. Let us take a look at the so-called Sturmpanzer IV, more on the name later. For this we first look at the various predecessor vehicles. Now the general concept was to mount the Schwere Infanteriegeschütz III, the heavy infantry support gun, with a 150mm caliber on a tank chassis. The first vehicle that was used was the Panzer IV without a turret. The whole gun with the wheels was put on top of it and the superstructure added to protect against small arms fire. The vehicle had many drawbacks, but the general idea having a mobile version of this gun was successful. In total 38 were produced or better converted. There was also a project to put the gun on a Panzer II chassis. As you can see, in this case the wheels of the gun were removed, as such it had a lower silhouette. A total of 12 were produced and they served in North Africa. An experience report from October 1942 noted that the gun was very effective, yet that the Panzer II chassis was insufficient. Engine, transmission and suspension were deemed too weak. Overheating of the engine was common. As such it was recommended to use a Panzer III chassis. Which brings us to the Sturminfanteriegeschütz III, literally assault infantry gun. Although keep in mind that this vehicle was requested by Hitler about 1 month before the aforementioned experience report of the previous vehicle was published. Hitler noted that the fighting in Stalingrad requires a heavy gun on a heavily armored vehicle. In just a few weeks 24 of these vehicles were built. 12 were shipped in October 1942 and 12 in November 1942. The first 12 that arrived at the front were engaged in the fighting in Stalingrad, whereas the other 12 were used in the failed relief attempt. The Sturminfanteriegeschütz III was a rushed makeshift vehicle. As the previous vehicles, the chassis was considered too weak. Yet the experiences gained from this vehicle were used in the Sturmpanzer IV. But first, a word from our sponsor here. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this episode and providing in-game footage of the various historical vehicles currently modeled in the game. As you can see, I played it a bit myself over the years. War Thunder is free to play on PC, Xbox and PlayStation. Just download and play. It's fully cross-platform, so PC players can shoot down console players and the other way around. War Thunder is extremely comprehensive. It allows to play more than 2000 vehicles like tanks, aircraft, helicopters and ships from the 1920s to current day vehicles. The vehicles are all very detailed and modeled down to the various technical components that can also be damaged and affect gameplay. War Thunder models in general aim to be visually as historically accurate as possible. One feature I like most about War Thunder is that it has a game mode where air forces and ground forces fight in the same battles. Since it also features ships, you can also try to dive bomb or torpedo ships as well. Additionally, there are various game modes that allow newcomers to learn the basics, whereas veterans can play harder game modes. If you want to have a shot at or with me, be sure to use the link in the description and claim War Thunder's large bonus pack for new players and everyone returning that hasn't played for the last 6 months or longer, featuring multiple premium vehicles, premium account time, rentals and a 3D decorator. A short look at the development of the Sturmpanzer IV. Shortly after the order to build the predecessor, the Sturminfanteriegeschütz III in September 1942, on the 2nd October 1942, Hitler gave the order to produce 40 to 60 vehicles with the heavy infantry support gun on a Panzer IV chassis, based on a conceptual design provided by the industry. At about mid-October 1942, Hitler requested a special ammunition for demolishing houses, namely thin-walled shells to maximize the explosive load, so-called Minengeschosse, literally mine shells. In February 1943, a wooden model was finished. In mid-May 1943, the first produced Sturmpanzer was shown to Hitler.
The experience gained from the previous vehicle on the Panzer III went into this vehicle. So one was to have sloped armor, and at the top you can see that the top is also slightly sloped. This is to increase the observation. Now another major importance on this vehicle was it should reuse as much existing components as possible. And for instance, the hatch for the driver was reused from the original Porsche Tigers when they were converted into Ferdinand tank destroyers.
Let us look at firepower first. After all, this vehicle was heavily focused on firepower. The previously mentioned 150mm gun was redesigned to be used inside the Sturmpanzer. The original gun had a combat weight of 1700 kg or 3,750 pounds, although some sources note also 1,800 kilograms. There was a lightweight type that was about 150 kilogram or 330 pounds lighter, but only few were produced. Although the wheels and many other elements that were not necessary inside the vehicle were removed, the gun with baseplate weighed 1,850 kg according to Jentz and Doyle. Note that some sources claim that there was a version that was 800 kg lighter, but this seems to be a wrong interpretation based on an Allied intelligence report. The barrel had an elevation of -8 to +30 degrees. The traverse was 15 degrees to the right and to the left. The maximum range for the high explosive shell was 4,300 meters. For the hollow charge shell against tanks, it was 1,500 meters. It could carry up to 38 shells. The high explosive shells weighed 38 kilogram. The explosive was about 8.6 kilogram according to German regulation. This is about 8 to 10 times the amount of explosives of the high explosive shell of a Tiger. Take this value with a grain of salt, since there were several variants and the values changed. For instance, German wartime sources sometimes give values for cast and pressed explosives, and they differ. The hollow charge shell should have no problem penetrating any Allied tanks due to the massive caliber. Although considering the fact that this was a rather low velocity gun, the flight path was rather steep, so the hit percentage was rather low. A report from September 1944 specifically notes this aspect. According to a report from a German prisoner of war, the high explosive shell were also successfully used against tanks.
So if we look at the chassis, you see it looks like a Panzer IV chassis, because it is, but there's one interesting difference. This is not rubber, this is all steel, and this was the result because initially they found out rather early that the gun, particularly the recoil, is too strong for the chassis, and it damaged it sometimes, and then there were several changes made to replace the various track wheels, but Jentz and Doyle point out that this was not consistently done. That in some cases only the two frontal road wheels were changed with steel tire, and with others with more, and so in this case all of them are just with steel rims and there's no rubber on them. Now let's talk about armor protection. So the bottom plate is 10 millimeters. This one is 30 plus 30 millimeters. This is 80 millimeters. This is 20 millimeters, and the front superstructure has 100 millimeters. The side is 50, and the top is 20 millimeters. Of course, some of these are already angled.
Some additional details here. The lower plate could also be 50 plus 50 millimeter instead of 80 millimeter, if it was a refurbished with an earlier Panzer IV chassis. The turret roof had 20 mm at 83 degrees according to Jentz and Doyle, but the German wartime source notes 50 mm. The Sturmpanzer was usually equipped with Schürzen, called armored skirts in English. This vehicle does not have any, as you can see, probably since in the area of Munster, Soviet anti-tank rifles are rarely used nowadays. As such, there is no necessity to worry about flanking shots.
Now let us take at mobility next. As you can suspect, this is probably not the most mobile vehicle, and you would be correct. It has a horsepower to weight ratio of just 9.4. To put this in context, the Königstiger, the King Tiger, which is not a particularly agile cat, has 10, and the Soviet heavy Russian tank IS-2 has 11.3 horsepower per metric ton. Now, interestingly enough, if you read the combat reports, from what I have seen, there was no major complaint about any mobility issues. Then again, the early reports, particularly for Kursk, this vehicle was used together with the Ferdinand tank destroyer, which was based on the Porsche Tiger and which was also not very known to be particularly agile. So it could be that maybe the horsepower to weight ratio was not a major issue for other reasons, but it could also be that we have the effect in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king.
The maximum speed is given with 35 to 40 kilometers per hour, whereas the average road speed was 20 kilometers per hour and cross-country speed of 15 to 18 kilometers per hour. The range was 210 kilometers on the road and 130 kilometers in average terrain. To put this in context, some values for the Soviet heavy tank IS-2. Its max speed on the road was about 37 kilometers per hour. Its cross-country speed 19 km per hour. The cross-country operational range of the IS-2 was about 120 km, and with external fuel tanks it was 185 km, whereas the Königstiger had about 120. So overall the values are similar to the heavy tanks here.
There were 4 variants of the Sturmpanzer. Now, I won't go too much into detail of the different variants, but we have a very interesting vehicle here because this should be the latest variant, but there's actually a difference compared to the blueprints provided by Doyle. So we'll talk about this DPM variant because it's probably of a Frankenstein monster because it has everything of the last variant except one piece. So we look at what are the major differences here. So when we start with the superstructure, this one is rectangular shaped. The previous 3 variants had a hexagonal shape. So basically here there was another diagonal plate, and this now is completely boxy in the front. The second major difference is here was a machine gun added. The previous versions didn't have a machine gun. Now the next thing that is really important, and this is only for the last variant as well, you see that the top is angled and then here it is in a 90-degree angle. All previous versions had a completely angled top armor. So this was also changed. Now originally this was a diagonal top armor for better observation. This was learned from the predecessor vehicle based on the Panzer IV chassis. Yet now there's the major final difference, and for this I had to get on top of the vehicle, and ideally don't hurt myself while doing this. Now what you can see here is we have not a commander cupola, which should be in the latest variant. In the latest variant there should be a commander cupola here. This wedge would be gone, and instead of this 2-piece opening hatch, there would be a complete commander's cupola, a German one, with your vision slits and everything. But this version does not have it. So I'm not sure why exactly. And hopefully I don't hurt myself now. I'm not sure if this was maybe one of the first variants of the last variant, that they had some leftover hatches and put them there, or if this was maybe salvaged from an older vehicle and used there because it was gone in this particular vehicle.
Now a bit of operational history. Jentz, Doyle and Friedli note, in post-war literature it is said that the Sturmpanzer was basically a successful vehicle for its purpose. However, the authors have not found any specific experience reports. Now I haven't found a full-blown experience report myself, but I found several statements on the experiences from the Battle of Kursk 1943 in the German military archives. The Battle of Kursk was also the first action of the Sturmpanzer IV. During this battle, the Sturmpanzer fought next to the Ferdinand tank destroyers. One major problem was that both vehicles were not equipped with machine guns, while at the same time they mounted the most powerful guns for their respective enemies, if we don't account for long-range artillery. The Ferdinand had the long version of the 88mm gun, whereas the Sturmpanzer mounted the 150mm infantry support gun. An experience report specifically notes that the lack of machine guns was a severe issue, since the supporting German infantry was pinned down and enemy infantry had to be engaged with the large caliber guns. Yet the main issue was that the progress was slow. As such, the enemy artillery could regroup itself and continue firing. The total losses are noted at 19 Ferdinands, most of them due to artillery hits on the gratings. 10 Sturmpanzer were lost. The majority was demolished by their crews after they were damaged by mines or artillery fire. Despite these problems, the Sturmpanzer Battalion 216 was able to break through the third line of defense, according to a German report, while the German infantry was 5 kilometers behind. The report notes that this success had to be forfeited since there were no tank reserves and the infantry was not able to follow up. The report notes the Sturmpanzer had proven itself extraordinarily, außerordentlich bewährt. A later report from September 1943 is interesting. It notes major issues with maintenance, namely that the Sturmpanzer needed a general overhaul, Generalüberholung. It specifically refers to the Battle of Kursk as well, noting that during the upcoming overhaul it is important to determine if the mine damage these vehicles received at the Battle of Kursk may have warped the hull. These Sturmpanzers were originally made operational again by exchanging the suspension. Yet the report notes that particularly these repaired tanks are a bit suspicious. Before we take a look at production, some words on the naming.
Now often this vehicle is also called Brummbär grumbling beer, which is a name that the Wehrmacht never used, so that's completely wrong. And often it's also called Sturmpanzer IV, which makes more sense, but technically is also incorrect. Why? Because this was the only Sturmpanzer that was called during the war this way. All the other tanks were renamed or were called after the war. So since there was only one Sturmpanzer, there was no need to add a 4 in the end.
The naming in this case is more important since it seems it was used to distinguish it from the Sturmgeschuetz and determine also which of the branches was responsible. On 11th April 1943, Hitler decided that the heavy infantry support gun on the Panzer IV, so the Sturmpanzer IV, was a Panzerjäger, tank destroyer, and belonged to Generaloberst Guderian of the armor branch, instead of the artillery branch, like the Sturmgeschuetz. On 4th May 1943, Hitler decided to call this version of the Sturmgeschütz the Sturmpanzer in order to identify the Sturmgeschütz of Panzer IV with the 15 cm Skoda heavy infantry support gun from the Sturmhaubitze, assault howitzer, with the light field howitzer in the assault gun. Nevertheless, in various documents the Sturmpanzer was called assault howitzer or assault gun as well. But it gets even better. As coincidence happened, when returning from the museum, I found an entry on Twitter that showed German World War II documents where one unit called itself propelled guns based on converted French tanks with German 75mm guns, Sturmpanzer. Technically, the term Panzerjäger tank destroyer would have been more appropriate, particularly due to weak armor and anti-tank gun. So unofficially the term Sturmpanzer seems to have been used as well, but officially this was the only Sturmpanzer. Note that these many different names are no exception. There are plenty of names for all kinds of weapons used in the documents. Let us take a short look at production. First, a look at the production numbers. The production started in April 1943 and likely ended in March 1945. At least that is the last data we have. Yet it was not continued production. The first 60 Sturmpanzer were produced in April and May 1943. After 6 months without any new Sturmpanzer being delivered, in December 1943, new Sturmpanzers left the factories until March 1945, about 242. So in total, 302 were accepted by the Heereswaffenamt. To put this in context, this was a rather rare vehicle considering that a bit more than 400 Jagdpanther and about 1,350 Tiger I were produced.
Now most of the Sturmpanzer were built not on new Panzer IV chassis but on refurbished ones. And this is also very interesting because in late war, all the other chassis were phased out basically out of production. So in the very late war, the intention was to use the Panther chassis and the Infanter 38T chassis. And so this tank would have not been produced more in the future, you would suspect, but actually it was scheduled for it. So Hitler wanted more of these to be produced even in very late war, or in the future of the late war. That never happened. And the Armeeminister basically said, okay, this will not be a problem, we just bring in old Panzer IVs, there should be enough around, and then we build those vehicles and refurbish them again.
To summarize, the Sturmpanzer IV was the end result of mounting a heavy infantry support gun on a tank chassis. Unlike its predecessors, it was not a makeshift solution. Although like its predecessors, there were problems with the chassis and suspension. It combined a lot of firepower with armor protection and thus ideal for providing close support for assaults. The amount of experience reports is limited, yet based on the information available, it was very likely successful. Be sure to use the link in the description and claim War Thunder's large bonus pack for new players and everyone returning that hasn't played for the last 6 months or longer, featuring multiple premium vehicles, premium account time, rentals and a 3D decorator.
Big thank you to the Panzermuseum Munster for inviting me. Thank you to Andy for supporting me with the camera.
To Andrew for reviewing the script. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video.
Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.